Vashti was dismissed, and Esther it's time for her to be crowned. But we're talking 4 years after Vashti had defied the king's orders. His orders was for her to come into his presence and to dance in front of his friends and his associates, and she refused that. Well, the king goes off to war. He comes back defeated. He begins thinking about not having someone there to console him. He begins thinking about what Vashti had done and why she was put out. And before he could repent, before he could say, I was wrong, his servants were right there. They were right there thinking, well, the king needs somebody to comfort him at this time. So they put a strategy together for all the young virgins in the town to come and to be at his beck and call, and for him to choose a wife from them. And this process is begun. He orders certain eunuchs to serve as preparers for the women, and then he had a eunuch that was going to be over the women after they had been with the king and the king was no longer interested in them. Things seem to be, from some perspectives, pretty good for the king, but it wasn't pretty good for the women. I think it was more foolish for the king than good for him. He had these men in his ear wanting to do things for him because they were concerned about his wife defying him, what it would mean for them. So they were looking at the trickle-down effect of things. So we finished up to verse 12 last time. So let's read verse 12 through 18 at this point. Verses 12 through 18, chapter 2, in the book of Esther. It says, each young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes. After she had completed 12 months preparation according to the regulations for the women, for thus were the days of their preparation appointed, 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. This prepared each young woman, each young woman went into the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Sheshgaz, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. Now, when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Hegai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Xerxes into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. So now a lot has taken place from the time in which the king got angry with Vashti. About 4 years later, he's in this process of finding his queen. Now this took a pretty long process. And as we look here in verse 12, we find that there's a 3-step procedure that the women went through. Yeah. Yeah, there was a 3-step procedure of preparation that the women went through for the king. So each girl was given 12 months of beauty treatments. They had to have a year's worth of beauty treatments. Now, if these men went out and got around 400 of the prettiest women in the land, and it still took another year for them to get pretty enough, I guess, for the king, I wonder what was he expecting? Or how young were these girls? That could be a question also. Here they are, the best that the land had, and it still took them another 12 months of beauty treatments. 6 months of oil baths and massages, and 6 months of perfume and cosmetic application. I imagine these women enjoyed those times. How many of you women have had a massage at a massage parlor? Man, okay. Well, Brother Ronald, you got to do better, brother. That should be an annual Christmas gift. Well, you know, every woman likes to be pampered a little bit. That's why they like pedicures and manicures and getting their hair done and things such as that. And these women had a full year of this. And, and they weren't bothered for that year. They were just being able to take care of themselves. They weren't having to go out in the fields and work. They were just able to take care of themselves. They were probably, some of them, becoming a little spoiled, wouldn't you think? Yeah. Some of them may have become a little spoiled, but it's safe to assume that they were also taught the proper etiquette for the position of a queen. So you have 400 women walking around here knowing how to behave as the queen of the country, or at least being taught how to. So that was the first thing. There was 12 months of preparation, beauty treatments. Second, there was, at the end of the preparation, each girl would be selected to spend one night with the king. Now, in order for her to look her best and to be on her best behavior, the young woman was given whatever clothing, whatever jewelry, whatever she wanted, in addition to what the servant suggested she carry in. Anything that she needed to provide anything additional she needed to provide for in order to please the king, she was able to, it was at her disposal. Third, after spending the night with the king, each girl returned to her permanent harem where the king's wives lived. This permanent harem was under the care of a eunuch by the name of Shashgaz, who was in charge of all the concubines. Now, I would imagine, after a year of being pampered, spending one night with this man, and then going back to a harem with the possibility of never having your name called to go back, I imagine it really set in with them at that point, the mess that they were actually in. That they weren't in a good situation. You ever heard the phrase, there's no such thing as a free lunch? Yeah, I imagine at this point they're really understanding this. Never again would these young ladies return to the king, I don't know why, unless he summons them. If he didn't summon them or call for them, they were stuck. Brother Roger?
Why do you think they went to a second house and not back to the first?
So they couldn't influence the women in the first house. Yeah. they couldn't share secrets.
But once they went there, could they go back home if they didn't like it? They couldn't do it.
No, they were under the king's care. I mean, they were his property. They were his property. Now, We would imagine that the king he couldn't remember all these young women's names. 400. I have a time sometime remembering Iola's name when I'm introducing her to somebody. I mean, my mind, it can go just blank. And I have a hard time remembering my own. I'm so glad these phones today, man, you don't have to remember phone numbers no more. So you would think this king, he couldn't remember all these women. Can you imagine him 3 months later saying, well, go get so-and-so? After you thought 90 days has went by? They were just faces. They were just faces for a night, many of them. So it would be safe to assume that many of these women were just doomed to a life spent as a widow. They would never know the touch of a man again. They're sentenced to a life of loneliness and unfulfilled lives. There were no children, no happily married after. They were just in a bad place. In a time like that for a woman or a man, you can understand if what's available today would have been available back then. Can you imagine all the drug overdoses, alcoholism, and everything else that's an issue today would have been back then? They were just sentenced to a life of loneliness. There was probably a lot of depression, a lot of anger bent up. Probably not just from the women, but also from their families that knew how they were stuck. There was nothing that they could do about it. Mervyn Brenneman said this. One commentator, he said, there was no guarantee that the king would call them, speaking of the young women, again. So many were confined to virtual widowhood. Again, we see how one person, the king, could use so many other human beings just to satisfy his own physical desire. Exorcism, abuse of power is evident in the demise of so many innocent women for his own physical pleasure. Even today, those who have no fear of God sometimes can't satisfy their desires without limit. And we're living in a time where we're seeing more and more of the limitlessness of men and women. I mean, it's been all over the news. How many men have not been accused of sexual assault here recently? And most of these men are married men who have a wife at home. But because of their position in life, the power that they have, their money, their influence, they seem to think that they can take their own liberty with other people. We see this abuse of power. It was pictured beautifully. If you ever want to see an abuse of power, just watch the video of George Floyd. That was a legitimate abuse of power. You know what I'm so glad is that I haven't heard anyone defend his actions. You haven't heard it on the news. You haven't heard it. You haven't read it in the paper. You haven't heard where anyone defended this man's actions. What we do hear is all police aren't the same, and I'm glad they're not. And it would be a travesty if we had to relate all cops to this one gentleman in this one episode that we see in his life. I don't know if he was having a bad day. I don't know what his situation was, but whatever it was, what he demonstrated at that time was a total abuse of power, and we can't have that. It's in the workplace where employers abuse their employees. We see it if we open our eyes. We see it in the education system. How some in higher up positions will abuse those in lower positions, and they do that through certain policies that they put in place. There is a such thing as an abuse of power, and here this king, man, he demonstrates it tremendously, because he's shattered so many women's lives for his own pleasure. So it becomes Esther's time. Esther was summoned to go to the king, and after she was summoned, Esther asked for no other clothing, no other jewelry than what Hegai, the eunuch, suggested to her. She trusted his judgment entirely, and after she was fully dressed and prepared for the king, her stately appearance as well as her humble spirit impressed everyone that she saw. We see that there in verse 15. In the last sentence it says, and Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. And when you see someone carry themselves in a manner that it's impressive without them ever opening their mouths, you can watch. Now tell me, have you not watched somebody walk into a room and you decide real quick, I'm going to stay away from that person? You automatically, just the way they carry themselves in a room, the first thought is, that's one arrogant somebody. And then you see someone else walk in the room and you say, I'd like to get to know them, or I'd like to have a conversation with them. Not so much of the opposite sex, just a person. It could be anybody walking in. Our first impression usually is the impression that makes the biggest impression on people. And she made a tremendous impression to where everyone who saw her, she obtained favor from them. She was taken to the palace. She was presented to the king in the 10th month of Tebeth, on the 7th year. Her striking beauty and behavior, it attracted the king more so than any of the other ladies. Clearly, she had a sweet, kind, loving spirit that struck the heart of the king. He was also delighted with Esther. He was so delighted with Esther that he set the royal crown upon her head, and he proclaimed her to be the queen. It doesn't, I don't know, maybe I'm missing something, but I don't see where it's clear that he set the crown on her head the next day. Is that clear in your Bibles when you're reading? That it was the next day. Now, it could have very well been. I'm not saying it wasn't. But all I know is that she made an impression on the king. Day in, day out, women are coming in. Yeah, she didn't want the extra jewelry or the extra clothing or anything else. She just walks in and she carries herself in a way to where the king delights in her. And at some point, he places the crown upon her head. And to celebrate this, the king, he throws this big bash. He's telling everyone, this is it. This is the person. This is my queen. This is the woman I want to spend my time with from here out. He met the right one, and it didn't matter who else was in line. Oh, if we could get young people to see that, to see the word, until they find the one, the where it doesn't matter who's behind them, then they just keep themselves pure and keep themselves for their husband or their wife. If we could get young people to understand that, how much better or how much less baggage they'll walk into a marriage with. It's just, and you know, this book touches a lot of real stuff, doesn't it? It's just real stuff. Here the king, he's celebrating this. He proclaims a holiday throughout the entire empire, and he gives gifts generously to not just the queen, but to all his servants and princes. In other words, you know what we do? Someone's getting ready to get married, we throw a shower for them, and everybody brings them gifts. Here, the king was so impressed with this woman that he invited people to come, and he was generous to everybody that came. It was reversed, and there wouldn't be showers today if that was the way things were done. But doesn't this strike you as being impressive in the way that she carried herself and presented herself to the king? That it just, for him, he was smitten, if that's the word. God was in control of his heart. Gosh. In that moment, God was in control of his heart. He knew what his plan for Esther was. And he knows his plan for you and I. He knows it. He has a plan for our children and our grandchildren. And I hope and pray that we're all praying now for our children and grandchildren's spouses. If you haven't started that and you got children or grandchildren that's not married, start praying now for their spouses. Praying that God would send someone to cross their path, that when they see this person and this person sees them, that the two of them will say, this is it. This is it. No one else. This is who God wants me to have. And that may not have been in the heart of exorcists, but it can be in the heart of people today. Any other questions or thoughts? Well, in verses 19 and 20, we see when the virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai when she was brought up by him. So what we note here is that the nationality of Esther, the fact that she's a Jew, it still kept a secret. She kept this secret even after a second group of women were brought into the king's harem. Despite Esther being queen, Mordecai still felt that she needed to protect her nationality. And he felt the king never needed to know that one of his wives, or that his wife, was not a Persian woman. Had it known that, she would have never become queen. And so the reference here is the fact in verse 20, Esther had always been an obedient child all of her life. And we see that in verse 20. So what we find here is that Esther was a beautiful young woman, but her beauty was far more than just physical. The fact that King Xerxes chose her from hundreds of other beautiful women shows this. There was something about her that stood out. It would be safe to say that her real beauty came from within. Her real beauty was found in a loving spirit and being a person of strong character. Now, undoubtedly, there's some qualities beyond beauty that attracted the king. First, we can see maybe there were traits of kindness and graciousness, humility, and love. And we see this in the fact that she not only pleased the king, but she found favor in everyone who saw her. And the eunuch that was in charge of her, she really impressed him. He gave her own quarters. She got extra beauty tips. She got all the extra things that some of the other girls would have wanted. It was given to her and no one else. So there was something about her kindness, maybe her generosity, or just her humility and love. It attracted people. Oh, we'd do well to teach our children, boys and girls, to display kindness and graciousness, to display humility and love to other people. when they're standing up for kids who are being bullied in school, they're going to attract the right people in their circle. But when they're standing off to the side laughing as the bully is bullying other kids, she or he, they're going to attract the wrong circle of friends. Esther was a woman of wisdom. She kept her nationality a secret, and by doing this, it demonstrated wisdom. She knew that if her neighbors were aware that she was a Jew, she'd be persecuted and she'd become the object of prejudice and discrimination. We see also that she demonstrated that she was trustworthy, dependable, faithful, and loyal. The reference to her being an obedient child in verse 20, it displays these things. And fourth, we can see that she was an intelligent and a capable young woman. Here, Xerxes must have detected these traits for him to be able to place the crown upon her head. Because being queen comes with enormous responsibilities. We remember in verse 9, chapter 1, as the king was throwing his party, he was hosting his, she was hosting one too. And here's the thing, ladies, you can help me out with this. When you get nothing but women together, when there's nothing there but, a big group of women, you can sense jealousy among the ranks, can't you? Yeah. I'm talking about not at godly places now. You wouldn't find that in church. You wouldn't find that at a church event. But you would find that in worldly things. You can picture a couple standing off in the corner saying, look at her. She thinks she knows everything. But it appeared that Vashti had everybody's attention and everyone's respect. It appears that she knew how to throw a party as a host so that it would honor the king. Because if people would grumble and complain, it brought dishonor upon her and the king. And whoever was going to be his new queen would have to be able to do the same thing. So it come with an enormous responsibility, and he chose this young woman. So we can sense that there was something intelligent about this woman, something capable about her. So these traits should be found in every young woman's life. As a matter of fact, it should be found in every young woman and young man's life. But when we're thinking of just young women should be kind and gracious. Proverbs says a gracious woman retains honor. Proverbs 11:16. Young women should be loving. For Matthew 22:39, it says, you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. Young women should be virtuous and wise. For in Proverbs 31:10, it says, who can find a virtuous wife? For her worth is far above rubies. Young women should be obedient to their parents. Ephesians 6:1 says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And young women should be humble, acknowledging the gifts that God's given them while they esteem others highly. Matthew 18:4, it says, therefore, whoever humbles himself as this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. I think that verse needs to be drilled in every child in America daily. If we don't teach them anything else before we send them out into this world, we should teach them this. Teach them to have enough confidence in who they are in the Lord that they're able to humble themselves. And as they see others esteem, they don't sense any jealousy, any envy, because they know who they are in the Lord. And they can appreciate someone else being esteemed, someone else being praised. I know we all like attention. We all like to know that we're appreciated. But this is something here This is something that is lacking today, especially among Lumbee people. The question is why across the board? No particular group of people, just people in general. Why is it that we can't be happy for someone else's success? We're not taught to. This is when, you know, that comes from telling our children we love them, telling them they're important, telling them that they can accomplish anything. A cousin of mine, we graduated college together. Tells you how smart she was. She actually finished high school a year after I did. Well, I don't know if it tells you how smart she was. It tells you how much I enjoyed college. Well, we finished college together, and her dad was working for my dad, and he made the statement to me one day. He said, "I'm proud of my girl." I said, "You should be." He said, "No, you don't understand. I'm really proud of her." Because there were times when I would just tell her, "You're not going to amount to nothing," hoping that would encourage her to make sure she worked hard. And I was just shaking my head. I never heard those words. I grew up, I never heard those words that you're never going to amount to nothing. And when we fill our children with this stuff, when teachers fill children with this stuff, when church folks fill children with this stuff, it leaves scars. And every time we're in the presence of children, we should be encouraging them. And I know, especially as teachers, people who work with children day in and day out, and you're working with them for 8 hours a day. Oh, it can get frustrating. Parents don't see their children hardly 8 hours a day. See them 3 or 4 hours and they put them to bed. But you're stuck with them for 8 hours a day. But we can't allow the frustration to be taken out on them. They need to know that they're empowered, that they can do whatever that they dream that they can do, so that we don't have people who are menaces to society. We do.
You have to share. You know, you just can't leave them home or go do whatever you want to do and not never spend time with them.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Kids have to have attention. And if mom and daddy is separated, if they're no longer living in the same house, mom can't hold the kids against daddy, and daddy can't hold the kids against mom. We've got to find a way to look at the kids. Now, I understand there are some situations that are unique. Some situations where it's just not a good situation for the kids to be in. And mom needs to protect her children, or dad needs to protect his children from that. But we can't use our children as pawns. They're not possessions that we get to play a game with. There are people that we're fostering to be the leaders of tomorrow. And we've got to see our kids in that light. We've got to give them everything that they need so that they won't feel jealous or angry. We have, and there's healthy competition is good now. Healthy competition is good. We were elementary school, Taylor and this kid from Mount Airy. They were percentage points from one another. Just percentage point, not even a point. Percentage points from one another. She outdid him in math. He outdid her in English. And his total was just a percentage point higher than hers. They were 1 and 2. They leave chapel. He's homeschooled for a couple of years. She's at the middle school. Then he goes to early college to start high school. She goes to Purnell. He comes to early college. He comes to Purnell his senior year, and he steps foot into school, and he's number one. He's number one. Taylor's about 9, and I'm excited. We didn't have nowhere near the number of kids graduating the year she graduated, and I was 100 and something. She was 9. I was proud, and she said, he looked at me, saw what my rank was, and he said, "What happened to you?" So, it outdone her. She was like, what does he mean, what happened to me? I said, well, I guess he was expecting you to be too. But so healthy competition is good, but we can't beat that into our kids so much that they're so stressed out that they can't be kids. They are still kids. And that was the thing. Taylor enjoyed high school. I'd have been fine if she was 25, 30, because she enjoyed high school. She enjoyed college. She had a great GPA. But there's some kids, they're just driven. And if that drives them, encourage them. If it doesn't drive them, find out what does and encourage them in that direction as long as it's constructive. Standing opposite of strong character and moral purity of Esther is all the immoral, illicit sexual behavior of young women and men today. So when we're standing opposite of what she demonstrates in the scriptures, we're seeing the immoral fabric of what's going on with kids today. There's too many kids, boys and girls, who are ignoring God's commandments or even the advice of their parents. And so it's no surprise when the average age of sexual activity for kids is dropping every year. It's dropping so to where it's getting close to not even being a teenage number. So we need this kind of character built in our children and our grandchildren. And it's got to start here. So when we see children and grandchildren of others coming in, that we encourage them. We take time to speak to them. We take time to let them know that they're important to the people at the house of God. And if our kids know they're important here, they can feel like they're important anywhere, because this is a place that's dominated by adults. It's dominated by adults. So they have to sense love and affection here if they're going to know that they're loved anywhere.